They emerged in a year when cinema still pretended to behave. When studios clung to safety and audiences were told what was acceptable. But beneath the polished surface of 1964, something feral was stirring. Filmmakers were growing impatient with rules. Actors were daring to fracture their own screen personas. Horror was becoming philosophical. Violence was becoming operatic. Desire was becoming political. And the screen, once restrained, began to pulse with rebellion. These are the 10 films that didn't just challenge boundaries, they quietly rewrote them. The Horror of Party Beach, 1964. The shoreline glistens under summer sunlight, teenagers laugh as rock music blasts from portable radios, and the Atlantic seems like nothing more than a glittering playground, until something foul rises from its depths, seaweed clinging to grotesque flesh, eyes bulging, teeth bared in unnatural hunger, and suddenly the American beach party fantasy mutates into radioactive nightmare. The Horror of Party Beach is often remembered for its outlandish monsters and drive-in energy, yet beneath its lurid surface lies a strangely revealing artifact of Cold War anxiety and youth culture collision, directed by exploitation impresario Del Tenney with unapologetic audacity. The narrative begins with the careless dumping of radioactive waste off the coast, a decision rooted in industrial indifference, and from that environmental sin emerge amphibious creatures who attack seaside revelers, their violence interrupting a generation's carefree rebellion. What unfolds is a collision between rock and roll modernity and atomic age paranoia, as local authorities scramble to contain a threat born from their own negligence. Shot in stark black and white on a minimal budget, the film transforms Long Island beaches into battlegrounds, using handheld immediacy and raw framing to compensate for limited resources, while the creature design, rubbery yet unforgettable, achieves a nightmarish quality precisely because of its awkward physicality, embodying mutation rather than elegance. Tenney understood his audience, balancing horror with extended musical performances by bands like the Del Aries, whose upbeat numbers create tonal dissonance that feels almost surreal, underscoring how youth culture in the 1960s was often dismissed as frivolous even as global tension simmered. Performances by John Scott and Alice Lyon ground the chaos with earnest determination, their characters navigating skepticism, fear, and the creeping realization that authority may not have answers, and while subtlety is not the film's aim, there is a genuine sincerity in its portrayal of small-town panic. Production challenges were evident, from limited effects technology to tight shooting schedules, yet those constraints birthed a scrappy energy that aligns with the era's burgeoning independent spirit, and the film's marketing leaned heavily into sensationalism, capitalizing on drive-in circuits hungry for shock value. Critics at the time were largely dismissive, labeling it schlock, but box office returns in regional markets proved that audiences were eager for visceral thrills that reflected contemporary fears of radiation and contamination. Censorship concerns were relatively mild compared to more explicit contemporaries, though its blend of sexuality and gore tested boundaries of taste, particularly in conservative communities wary of both monster movies and youth rebellion. Historically, the film occupies a fascinating intersection between 1950s creature features and the more transgressive horror wave that would crest later in the decade, foreshadowing environmental horror themes that would resurface in the 1970s. Its legacy endures less in prestige than in cult devotion, inspiring midnight screenings and affectionate reappraisals that celebrate its unabashed weirdness and cultural timestamp. What makes it daring in retrospect is not technical perfection but its chaotic fusion of beach party exuberance with apocalyptic consequence, daring to suggest that beneath America's sunlit optimism lurked toxic residue capable of spawning nightmares, and that the monsters attacking teenagers were not supernatural invaders but grotesque byproducts of human irresponsibility. The Masque of the Red Death, 1964. Firelight flickers across crimson tapestries as masked courtiers whirl in decadent celebration, their laughter echoing through stone corridors while plague ravages the countryside beyond the castle gates. And in that collision between opulence and mortality lies the intoxicating menace of the Masque of the Red Death, a gothic fever dream that transformed horror into visual opera. Directed by Roger Corman and again anchored by the commanding presence of Vincent Price, the film adapts Edgar Allan Poe's allegorical tale into a lush meditation on power, cruelty, and spiritual corruption, centering on Prince Prospero, a satanic aristocrat who seals himself and his decadent guests inside a fortified abbey to escape the Red Death, a mysterious pestilence that kills with grotesque swiftness. From its opening images of villagers collapsing in scarlet agony to the saturated interiors of Prospero's domain, the film immerses viewers in a world where color becomes narrative language. Cinematographer Nicholas Reg, long before becoming a celebrated director, bathes each chamber in distinct hues: violet, emerald, gold, culminating in the infamous Red Room that symbolizes both temptation and annihilation, creating a visual grammar that elevates the material beyond pulp horror into something almost metaphysical. Price's Prospero is icy and philosophical, a man who cloaks sadism in intellectual superiority, and the actor relishes the complexity, portraying not a raving tyrant but a cultured nihilist convinced of humanity's inherent weakness, while young heroine Francesca, played by Jane Asher, represents fragile innocence confronted by aristocratic decadence. Produced on a modest budget under American International Pictures, the film maximizes limited resources through elaborate set design and bold Technicolor cinematography, proving that atmosphere can outshine expense. Corman, known for efficiency, shot the film quickly in the United Kingdom, utilizing standing castle sets to create grandeur without extravagance. The score swells with ominous undertones, blending medieval textures with modern tension, reinforcing the inevitability creeping toward Prospero's insulated world. At release, critics were divided, some dismissing it as stylish excess, others praising its painterly ambition, yet over time it has been recognized as one of Corman's most sophisticated works and a high point in the Poe cycle. Commercially successful relative to its budget, it demonstrated that horror audiences would embrace thematic weight alongside spectacle. The film's boldness in 1964 lay in its unapologetic sensuality and moral bleakness. Prospero's open devotion to Satan, the undercurrents of eroticism, and the unflinching depiction of plague challenged the era's lingering production code restraints, while its final sequence, masked figures of different colored deaths moving through the landscape, suggested a cosmic indifference that few mainstream films dared articulate. Emerging during a decade shadowed by nuclear dread and social upheaval, the film's allegory of privileged elites hiding from catastrophe felt disturbingly contemporary, and its influence can be traced through later Gothic revivals and art horror aesthetics that treat color as psychological weaponry. Rather than offering comfort, it leaves viewers with a chilling inevitability. No fortress can outlast mortality, no ideology can bribe death, and even the most decadent mask eventually cracks, revealing the universal fate beneath. The Last Man on Earth, 1964. The world is silent, and that silence is the first character you meet. Empty streets, abandoned houses, wind slipping through cracked windows as if searching for a pulse that no longer exists, and at the center of it all stands a solitary figure driving through a graveyard of civilization, hammer and stake in hand, his routine mechanical yet haunted by despair. The Last Man on Earth unfolds like a waking nightmare long before post-apocalyptic cinema became fashionable, placing viewers inside a devastated Earth where a mysterious plague has transformed humanity into nocturnal, vampire-like creatures and left one man, Dr. Robert Morgan, seemingly immune. Portrayed with mournful gravity by Vincent Price, Morgan is not a triumphant survivor but a spiritually exhausted relic, and the film's boldness lies precisely in that inversion of heroism. He is less conqueror than coroner of a species, performing daily executions with clinical detachment while internally unraveling under the weight of unbearable solitude. Adapted from Richard Matheson's novel I Am Legend, the film wrestles with existential terror more than physical horror, structuring its narrative through cyclical days and flashbacks that gradually reveal how society collapsed and how Morgan lost his family, forcing the audience to inhabit not only a ravaged landscape but also a ravaged psyche. Directors Ubaldo Ragona and Sidney Sacco craft a stark visual language using desolate Roman locations to mimic an American wasteland, employing high-contrast black and white cinematography that renders streets ghostly and interiors suffocating, turning sunlight into temporary sanctuary and darkness into a suffocating siege. The low budget, estimated around $300,000, imposed constraints that paradoxically intensify the atmosphere. Sparse sets and limited creature effects force attention onto mood, performance, and philosophical dread rather than spectacle, while the minimalist score underscores isolation rather than melodrama. Price, often associated with Gothic flamboyance, restrains his theatrical instincts here, delivering a performance built on repetition, ritual, and suppressed grief, his voiceover functioning like a confession carved into stone. Production was fraught with tension, particularly between Matheson and the producers over tonal interpretation, yet that friction arguably sharpened the film's bleak edge, preserving its refusal to romanticize survival. Upon release, critical reception was muted, some reviewers dismissing it as another low-budget horror import, and box office returns were modest, yet its influence would prove seismic. It laid groundwork for modern zombie mythology and directly inspired later adaptations including The Omega Man and the 2007 blockbuster I Am Legend, while also informing the social allegory of George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead. What made it daring in 1964 was not merely its apocalyptic premise but its moral reversal. As the narrative unfolds, the so-called monsters begin to resemble a new society, and Morgan's crusade acquires unsettling ambiguity, challenging audiences to question who truly represents humanity. In a decade still negotiating Cold War anxieties and atomic paranoia, the film transformed viral contagion and extinction into intimate tragedy, daring to suggest that loneliness, not death, is civilization's final horror, and that the last man on Earth may also be the last relic of an outdated morality. Dead Ringer, 1964. In a dimly lit funeral parlor, grief hangs in the air like perfume masking decay, and two identical faces, one hardened by poverty, the other polished by wealth, stand on opposite sides of destiny, poised for a collision that will shatter the illusion of reinvention. Dead Ringer unfolds as a sleek melodrama infused with noir fatalism, directed with polished precision by Paul Henreid and anchored by a dual performance from Bette Davis that transforms sibling rivalry into operatic tragedy. Davis portrays twin sisters Edith Phillips and Margaret DeLorca, separated by decades of resentment after Margaret marries the wealthy man once loved by Edith, and when Margaret appears at her husband's funeral dripping in diamonds while Edith struggles to keep her cocktail lounge afloat, envy curdles into calculated desperation. The film invites viewers into a morally treacherous exchange of identities as Edith seizes the opportunity to murder her sister and assume her privileged life, yet the narrative tension arises not from the act itself but from the slow, suffocating realization that wealth cannot erase guilt nor silence suspicion. Davis differentiates the twins with remarkable nuance. Margaret icy and imperious, Edith weary yet burning with suppressed ambition, using posture, vocal modulation, and subtle facial shifts to construct two distinct psychologies within a single frame, a technical and emotional feat achieved through careful blocking and optical effects that were sophisticated for their time. Cinematographer Ernest Haller cloaks interiors in shadow and reflective surfaces, reinforcing themes of duplication and deception, while the restrained musical score underscores mounting paranoia rather than melodramatic flourish. Produced by Warner Brothers on a moderate budget, the film relied heavily on Davis's star power and the novelty of her dual role, and production required meticulous planning to execute split-screen sequences convincingly, demanding precise choreography and patience from cast and crew. Upon release, critics praised Davis's performance even when they regarded the plot as melodramatic, and the film performed solidly at the box office, reinforcing Davis's enduring draw during a decade that often relegated older actresses to supporting roles. While it did not garner major awards, it strengthened the psychological thriller subgenre centered on identity substitution and moral collapse, echoing earlier noir traditions while embracing the heightened sensibility of the 1960s. Controversy was minimal compared to other boundary-pushing films of the year, yet its daring resided in its unapologetic focus on female ambition and moral transgression, presenting a protagonist who commits murder not in self-defense but in pursuit of status, challenging conventional expectations of feminine virtue. Historically, the film sits at the crossroads of classical Hollywood melodrama and emerging psychological complexity, reflecting societal anxieties about class mobility, duplicity, and the cost of reinvention in a rapidly modernizing America. Its long-term legacy is anchored in Davis's fearless embodiment of duality, influencing later narratives built around doppelgangers and identity theft, and reminding audiences that the most dangerous transformations are not supernatural but self-authored. In its shadowed corridors and mirrored hallways, Dead Ringer suggests that envy can become architecture, that identity can be tailored like a costume, and that stepping into another life may mean forfeiting one's own soul in the process, leaving behind not triumph but a haunting echo of what was lost in the exchange. Blood and Black Lace, 1964. Mannequins stand frozen in elegance, draped in haute couture within the sleek corridors of a Roman fashion house, their lifeless beauty mirroring the masked killer who stalks among them, turning glamour into slaughter and transforming style into something sinister. Blood and Black Lace, directed by visionary stylist Mario Bava, did not merely push boundaries in 1964, it detonated them, establishing the blueprint for the giallo genre and redefining how violence could be framed through color, composition, and perverse elegance. The plot centers on a series of murders targeting models connected to a fashion salon, each killing executed with ritualistic flair by a faceless assailant clad in black trench coat and featureless mask, and while the narrative weaves through blackmail, jealousy, and greed, its true power lies in atmosphere rather than whodunit mechanics. Bava, who also served as cinematographer, bathes scenes in saturated reds, blues, and greens, using Technicolor not as decoration but as psychological weaponry, creating tableaus that feel like twisted paintings where beauty and brutality coexist in hypnotic tension. The camera glides with predatory patience, lingering on textures, silk, glass, skin, before shattering tranquility with sudden violence, and the editing juxtaposes stillness with shock, teaching future filmmakers how suspense can bloom from aesthetic control. Performances by Cameron Mitchell and Eva Bartok anchor the ensemble with intrigue and duplicity, yet the film intentionally fragments characterization, suggesting that in a world obsessed with surface, identity becomes disposable, a thematic choice that elevates the material beyond exploitation. Produced on a modest Italian budget, the film relied on ingenuity rather than excess, and Bava's meticulous lighting design compensated for financial limitations, turning studio interiors into labyrinthine catwalks of dread. Composer Carlo Rusticelli's score oscillates between jazzy sophistication and ominous undercurrents, reinforcing the collision between high fashion and homicidal mania. Upon release, critical response in Italy was mixed, some critics unsettled by its graphic depictions of violence against women, while others recognized its formal innovation. Commercially, it performed respectably, particularly in international markets where its exotic aesthetic distinguished it from American horror fare. Controversy followed, with censorship boards in certain countries trimming scenes deemed excessively brutal, yet those very sequences would later be hailed as pioneering for their stylized intensity. Historically, the film's impact cannot be overstated. It laid the structural and visual groundwork for later giallo masterpieces and directly influenced directors from Dario Argento to American slasher auteurs decades later, its masked killer archetype echoing through horror cinema. In a decade still negotiating the loosening grip of censorship codes, Blood and Black Lace dared to eroticize color and choreograph murder with operatic grace, challenging audiences to confront the uneasy truth that spectacle can seduce even as it horrifies. Its legacy endures not only in genre history but in modern visual storytelling, where lighting and design often carry emotional weight equal to dialogue, and in its shimmering, blood-soaked frames we see the birth of horror as high art, unapologetically beautiful and disturbingly intimate all at once. Black God, White Devil, 1964. The sun scorches the cracked earth of Brazil's northeastern backlands, a merciless sky pressing down upon peasants whose faith and fury simmer beneath the dust, and into that blistering landscape strides a film that feels less like fiction and more like prophecy carved into stone. Black God, White Devil erupts with elemental intensity, directed by Glauber Rocha, one of the central architects of the Cinema Novo movement, a cinematic revolution determined to confront poverty, oppression, and spiritual unrest without compromise. The narrative follows Manuel, a cattle ranch hand who rebels against exploitative landowners and flees with his wife Rosa into the harsh Sorteo, seeking salvation first under a self-proclaimed holy man and later alongside a bandit leader whose mythic presence evokes both terror and hope. And through this odyssey, Rocha transforms the Western archetype into political allegory, exposing a Brazil fractured by inequality and haunted by messianic illusions. The film's boldness lies not merely in its subject but in its form. Shot in stark black and white by cinematographer Waldemar Lima, the visuals oscillate between documentary realism and operatic abstraction, framing human figures as silhouettes against vast horizons, suggesting that individuals are dwarfed by historical forces yet still capable of defiance. Rocha's direction is restless and confrontational, employing abrupt cuts, raw sound design, and non-professional actors whose performances radiate authenticity rather than polish. And the result is a cinema that feels alive with urgency, rejecting Hollywood gloss in favor of ideological confrontation. Actor Geraldo Del Rey imbues Manuel with volatility and confusion, a man torn between faith and violence, while Yona Magalhães as Rosa anchors the narrative with moral clarity and resilience, her gaze often serving as the audience's conscience amid chaos. The score by Sergio Ricardo blends regional folk influences with discordant tones, reinforcing the tension between sacred devotion and revolutionary rage. Produced on a modest budget during a politically volatile period that would soon culminate in Brazil's 1964 military coup, the film carried risk both artistically and politically, confronting power structures at a time when dissent invited repression. Upon release, it polarized audiences. Some Brazilian critics embraced it as a national awakening, while others decried its bleakness and radicalism, yet internationally it garnered acclaim at festivals, positioning Rocha as a formidable voice in global cinema. Awards recognition followed in art house circuits, cementing its status as a landmark of political filmmaking. Controversies surrounding its portrayal of religion and violence reflected broader societal tensions, but those very provocations secured its legacy as a daring confrontation with myth and authority. In historical context, Black God, White Devil stands as a manifesto for Cinema Novo's credo, an idea in the head and a camera in the hand, inspiring generations of filmmakers to treat cinema as an instrument of resistance rather than escapism. Its long-term impact extends beyond Brazil, influencing politically charged auteurs worldwide who saw in Rocha's work proof that raw aesthetics could carry epic weight. Even today, its images of parched landscapes and desperate pilgrims resonate as universal metaphors for societies caught between false prophets and systemic injustice, reminding viewers that revolution, whether spiritual or political, is never clean, never simple, and never free from sacrifice. Band of Outsiders, 1964. A café jukebox hums softly as three young Parisians drift through the city with restless energy, their conversations playful yet edged with melancholy, and in their aimless wanderings we glimpse a generation intoxicated by cinema, romance, and the seductive promise of rebellion. Band of Outsiders, directed by Jean-Luc Godard, is at once a crime story, a love triangle, and a cinematic manifesto disguised as whimsy, embodying the spirit of the French New Wave while quietly subverting its own conventions. The plot revolves around Franz and Arthur, two small-time schemers who persuade the shy Odile to assist in robbing her wealthy aunt's home, yet the heist itself feels secondary to the fragile chemistry among the trio, and Godard deliberately fragments narrative momentum with digressions, voiceover commentary, and moments of spontaneous poetry that challenge traditional storytelling. Anna Karina's Odile radiates vulnerability and curiosity, her expressive eyes conveying both innocence and quiet rebellion, while Sammy Fry and Claude Brasseur infuse Franz and Arthur with contrasting temperaments, one romantic and introspective, the other brash and impulsive, creating a dynamic that oscillates between camaraderie and rivalry. Shot in luminous black and white by Raoul Cotard, the cinematography captures Paris not as postcard perfection but as living terrain, from suburban streets to the iconic sprint through the Louvre, a sequence that transforms cultural monument into playground and cinematic joke. Perhaps most emblematic is the impromptu Madison dance scene in a cafe, where the trio moves in synchronized detachment, the camera observing with affectionate irony, and in that moment Godard crystallizes youth as both performance and existential statement. Produced on a relatively modest budget, The film exemplifies the new wave ethos of mobility and experimentation, utilizing natural light and real locations to cultivate immediacy, while Michel Legrand's jazzy score underscores the film's buoyant yet wistful tone. Upon release, critical reception was mixed. Some praised its innovation and charm, others found its narrative looseness perplexing, yet over time it has become one of Godard's most beloved works, celebrated for its accessible playfulness compared to his more overtly political projects. Commercial performance was moderate, but its cultural impact proved enduring, influencing filmmakers from Quentin Tarantino, who named his production company after the film, to countless indie auteurs drawn to its blend of cool detachment and emotional undercurrent. Controversy was minimal in overt political terms, yet its casual treatment of crime, sexuality, and authority subtly challenged societal norms, reflecting a youth culture increasingly skeptical of tradition. In historical context, Band of Outsiders captures a transitional moment when cinema itself was renegotiating its grammar, daring to foreground style and self-awareness without abandoning emotional intimacy. Its legacy lies not in spectacle but in attitude, in the way it invites audiences to see life as improvisation and cinema as conversation, and in its tender portrayal of youthful longing. It reminds us that rebellion can be playful yet profound, fleeting yet unforgettable, etched into memory like the echo of footsteps racing through a museum that once symbolized permanence but now feels thrillingly alive. Red Desert, 1964. Smoke coils into a gray sky above industrial towers, metallic structures hum with mechanical indifference, and a woman wanders through this alien landscape as though searching for a color that no longer exists in her world. And in that uneasy stillness begins one of the most psychologically daring films of the decade. Red Desert marks the first color feature by Michelangelo Antonioni, yet color here is not decorative flourish but emotional architecture, manipulated with obsessive precision to mirror the fractured interior of its protagonist, Giuliana. Played with aching vulnerability by Monica Vitti, Giuliana drifts through the industrial outskirts of Ravenna after surviving a car accident, her anxiety manifesting as a profound estrangement from both environment and relationships, and Antonioni situates viewers inside her perception, allowing factories, ships, and toxic landscapes to feel less like backdrops and more like extensions of her psychological dislocation. The plot resists conventional propulsion, focusing instead on fragments of interaction, her distant husband Hugo, her tentative connection with Corrado, portrayed by Richard Harris, and through these encounters the film explores alienation in a modern world where technological progress outpaces emotional comprehension. Antonioni famously altered physical locations to achieve specific hues, painting trees and structures to craft a palette dominated by sickly greens, corrosive yellows, and oppressive grays, transforming the environment into an emotional spectrum where natural color seems contaminated by industry. Cinematographer Carlo Di Palma collaborates in this vision, composing frames that isolate Giuliana within vast mechanical expanses, dwarfing her against pipelines and smokestacks, while long takes and measured pacing cultivate a sense of suspended time. The sound design amplifies unease, blending industrial noise with sparse dialogue, and the score by Giovanni Fusco underscores tension without melodrama, allowing silence to resonate as deeply as music. Produced with moderate Italian financing and international collaboration, the film faced logistical challenges in manipulating real industrial spaces to Antonioni's exacting standards, yet that meticulous control yielded imagery unprecedented in its psychological abstraction. Upon release, critical response was polarized. Some hailed it as a masterpiece of modernist cinema, while others dismissed it as inaccessible, yet it went on to win the Golden Lion at the Venice Film Festival, affirming its artistic significance. Commercial performance was modest compared to mainstream fare, but its influence reverberated across global art cinema, shaping how filmmakers approach color as narrative device rather than mere aesthetic. Controversy centered less on censorship and more on its thematic bleakness, as audiences accustomed to romantic drama encountered a portrayal of mental instability stripped of sentimentality. In historical context, Red Desert crystallizes 1960s anxieties about industrialization and environmental degradation, anticipating ecological concerns that would intensify decades later. and its legacy endures in contemporary films that explore psychological alienation through visual minimalism. What makes it daring even now is its refusal to comfort. Antonioni denies catharsis, instead offering a haunting meditation on modern existence where progress and emptiness coexist, and in Juliana's fragile search for meaning amid toxic beauty, we witness a cinema brave enough to confront the quiet despair beneath technological triumph. A Fistful of Dollars, 1964. Dust swirls across a desolate frontier town, boots crunch against wooden planks, and a lone stranger rides in with eyes narrowed not in heroism but in calculation, and in that arrival the Western is reborn with a cynical grin and a revolver drawn low. A Fistful of Dollars, directed by Sergio Leone, detonated conventions that Hollywood had polished for decades, transforming the noble cowboy into an opportunistic antihero and reshaping the genre into something operatic, violent, and morally ambiguous. Inspired unofficially by Yojimbo by Akira Kurosawa, the story follows the enigmatic man with no name, portrayed with minimalist charisma by Clint Eastwood, who manipulates two rival families in a Mexican border town, playing them against each other with sardonic detachment. Eastwood, then known primarily for television work, infuses the character with laconic cool, communicating volumes through squint and posture rather than dialogue, and Leone's direction magnifies this restraint through extreme close-ups, prolonged standoffs, and sudden eruptions of gunfire that shatter silence like thunder. Shot in Spain on a relatively modest budget, the film's production faced skepticism from financiers uncertain about a European-made Western, yet Leone's audacious stylistic choices, sweeping wide shots contrasted with intimate facial studies, created a visual language both mythic and gritty. Cinematographer Massimo Dallamano captures arid landscapes as moral battlegrounds, while the now legendary score by Ennio Morricone redefines how music shapes tension, blending whistles, electric guitar, and percussive accents into a soundscape that feels simultaneously ancient and modern, elevating each duel into ritual. Upon release in Italy, the film achieved remarkable box office success, igniting the spaghetti western phenomenon, though legal disputes soon followed as Kurosawa recognized the narrative parallels to Yojimbo, resulting in a settlement that granted him a share of profits. Critical reception evolved over time. Initial reviews were mixed, with some critics decrying its brutality and stylistic excess, yet audiences embraced its raw energy, and its eventual international release cemented Eastwood's star status while redefining Western archetypes. Controversy over its violence reflected shifting cultural appetites, as the sanitized heroism of earlier Westerns gave way to morally gray landscapes resonant with 1960s disillusionment. Historically, A Fistful of Dollars stands as a seismic pivot point, influencing not only Westerns but action cinema at large, its anti-hero template echoed in countless films where protagonists operate beyond conventional morality. Its legacy persists in modern genre storytelling, where style and score intertwine to create mythic atmosphere, and in Leone's bold reframing of American mythology through European lens, we see a daring reimagination that dared to strip away romanticism and reveal a harsher, more ambiguous frontier. In that dust-choked town where justice is negotiable and survival depends on cunning, cinema discovered a new kind of hero, one who does not ride toward sunset seeking redemption, but toward opportunity, reshaping legend with every measured step. Strait-jacket, 1964. A thunderclap splits the night, an axe rises and falls in a blur of domestic fury, and in that single violent eruption, a carefully constructed American household collapses into madness, setting the stage for one of 1964's most audacious psychological thrillers. Strait-jacket opens with an act of brutal passion, Lucy Harbin discovering her husband's infidelity and responding with decapitation, an image so shocking for its time that it announced the film's refusal to soften its edges, and from that moment forward it becomes less a tale of murder than an excavation of fractured identity. Directed by William Castle, a showman famed for theatrical gimmicks, the film subverts expectations by trading carnival spectacle for simmering psychological unease, although Castle still leaned into sensational marketing, reportedly handing out cardboard axes in theaters to amplify the shock value. At the center stands Joan Crawford as Lucy, freshly released from an asylum after 20 years and attempting to reintegrate into her daughter's life, and Crawford delivers a performance steeped in volatility, oscillating between maternal vulnerability and something far more unstable, her angular features and commanding presence transforming every close-up into a battleground of repression and rage. The narrative situates viewers inside Lucy's uneasy homecoming, where whispers of past violence mingle with fresh murders that echo the original crime, and Castle deliberately blurs perception, encouraging suspicion to drift between Lucy, her daughter Carol, and the suffocating small-town environment that feeds on scandal. Cinematographer Arthur Arling frames the rural California setting in stark black and white compositions, stripping away warmth and creating an atmosphere where daylight offers no comfort, while the editing lingers just long enough to cultivate doubt without prematurely revealing its hand. The film's budget was modest, yet careful set design and tight staging concentrate tension within domestic spaces, transforming kitchens and bedrooms into psychological traps rather than safe havens. Behind the scenes, Crawford was deeply invested in the project, recognizing in Lucy an opportunity to reassert her dramatic power during a period when aging actresses were often marginalized, and her collaboration with Castle was marked by professional intensity rather than camp excess, resulting in a performance that resists parody despite later pop-cultural caricatures. Upon release, critics were divided, some dismissing the film as lurid exploitation, others acknowledging Crawford's commanding presence and the narrative's nerve in confronting female anger and mental illness at a time when such subjects were typically sanitized. Box office returns were respectable, aided by Castle's promotional flair, and while awards recognition eluded it, the film contributed to the evolving psychothriller landscape that followed in the wake of Hitchcock's Psycho, pushing further into themes of fractured identity and generational trauma. Its controversy stemmed less from censorship battles than from its unsettling portrayal of motherhood tainted by violence, a depiction that unsettled 1960s audiences accustomed to idealized domestic femininity. In retrospect, the film's legacy lies in its unapologetic central performance and its willingness to align horror with psychological repression rather than supernatural menace, influencing later explorations of maternal instability and unreliable perspective. What makes it daring even now is its refusal to offer easy absolution. Lucy is neither purely victim nor pure monster, and the film invites viewers to confront the uncomfortable possibility that identity can be reshaped, manipulated, and weaponized within the very structures meant to nurture it, leaving behind an echoing question about how well we truly know the faces closest to us. Darkness was not a trend in 1964, it was a declaration. These films tore through comfort and exposed raw nerves beneath glamour and genre. They challenged morality, politics, faith, identity, and myth. They painted with blood, shadow, dust, and industrial smoke. They redefined horror, revolutionized the Western, and turned alienation into art. They proved cinema could be dangerous and beautiful at the same time. If these films still resonate, it is because their courage still burns. Like, comment, and subscribe, because the next cinematic rebellion is waiting.